Thanks for joining CBC Rewind, where we sit down with Pastor Gary as he dives deeper into his sermon.
All right, CBC, thank you for tuning in today. Today we have Pastor Gary. How are you today?
Pastor Gary's doing good, man. What you got for me today? You going to throw me some questions?
I got a couple, yeah.
Are they hard?
I don't know. I guess you're to determine.
All right, let's see.
So we'll be discussing last week's sermon entitled In the Fire But Never Alone.
In the Fire But Never Alone. Daniel 3.
So, okay, this first one. So you mentioned how we have to be in the furnace together as a church so we can be there for each other. Not just because we want to appear to be helpful, but because we want to be. So you talked about how we can't come to church for the social aspect or the appearance alone. So for someone who might not realize that they're doing all this for an appearance and that they aren't really getting anything out of coming to church, how might they realize that their intentions are not really in the right place?
All right, good. Let's break that down, okay? So this whole aspect of being there for someone else when they're in, as Isaiah 48:10 says, a furnace of affliction. Okay, there are some serious, at any given time, the larger your church, the more likelihood, even statistically, that you're going to have somebody who's in a real furnace.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, ALS, cancer, chemo treatment, bankruptcy, divorce. I mean, these are things that happen in a fallen world. I am so pleased, so jacked up about the idea that our church reaches out to one another. And that's only increasing. Galatians 6:2 says, carry one another's burdens, and in so doing fulfill the law of Christ. What is the law of Christ? The law of Christ is love. To see someone go through a tragedy and then a handful of people walk through that with them, each offering their own perspective, their own encouragement, their own gift, is a really cool thing. That's the way the body is supposed to function. People, sometimes get down on the church, but not this church necessarily, but I'm sure they do. But the church, the big church. But this is a place to care for one another. And if you've been through something, you understand the pain and the confusion, the loss, the hurt, the grief, the exhaustion that goes along with trying to make your way through a treatment, trying to, even caregivers. Oh my gosh, caregivers. They need as much, if not more, attention than the person who's ill.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we have to carry one another's burdens. There, but for the grace of God, go we. And many of us have suffered the afflictions that others are now suffering, and God has prepared for us an area of ministry that's very important. I think of things like, I'm always networking people together. Miscarriages, loss of a baby, cancer. People don't realize this, but I'm always looking for putting people together. Basically, it starts out with a cup of coffee and ends up with sometimes a lifelong friendship. Mm. Not always, but that's a big, huge thing in the church. All right, that was kind of the first thing you asked me. The second thing you asked me about was this idea of appearances. Now, why did I bring up appearances? Well, in Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, tells everyone to bow down immediately and worship this 90-foot by 90-foot piece of gold. And in lockstep, in unison, like something you see in some sort of Disney movie, they all fall down at the same time and they all worship. Well, don't tell me that's worship. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Come on, they're trying to save their own life. They're trying to get something out of it. They're trying to spare themselves misery. So they are putting on appearances. It looks as though they're worshiping, but they're not. So sometimes I think we can do that in our own life. This idea, and we're creatures of habit, which is okay. It can be good, can be bad. We can't find ourselves just lifelessly bowing down out of muscle memory or spiritual memory and going through the motions, singing a song. I mean, there's an effort that has to be made to press in and lean in on God. And sometimes people say, well, I just don't feel like God's doing anything in my life. Well, God's doing something in your life. We're just not aware of it. So oftentimes we're maybe going through the motions or here you go, doing what we've always done when God's singing a new song in a new and living way. Our walks ought to be dynamic, not static. Okay. And if we do that without bringing new people into our life that add texture to our walk, that challenge us or hold us accountable, then the same old will eventually become same old, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our methodology, our approach to God. Relationships are not static, they're dynamic. So anyway, sometimes it appears as though we're worshiping, but are we? It's a fair question. And if we are really, just kind of going through the motions, then we know what we have to do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's my point.
All right. So next one, I just said, I really like what you said about you are in the furnace, the Spirit of God is in you, so that means God's in the furnace with you. When people are going through trials, it's very common to feel isolated and that there doesn't really seem to be a way out. And for me, at least, thinking with this mentality just kind of makes you feel not as alone as it might really seem. And so I've always heard that God would never put you through anything He didn't think you were capable of handling. So would that be applicable to this? Just because if you think about it, He's right there with you and He can handle anything.
Yeah, in a way, I would disagree with that statement. I know people say that, and because it's said often enough, people.
Mm-hmm.
But think about it. I think God often, or whenever necessary in His sovereignty, will allow us to go through something that we're not capable of handling. Well, he did that before we were ever born. He came up with the law and asked us to live by it, knowing that we couldn't, in and of ourselves, handle it.
Yeah.
But why? I think God will often allow, or as often as needed, allow us to be in a situation that we cannot handle, so that we lean on Him, depend on Him, and have a holy desperation and hunger for Him. Look at the ministry of Jesus. He was put on the Mount of Temptation in a situation that, being fully God and fully man, could not handle.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't supposed to handle that on his own, apart from the Spirit of God and apart from the Father, right?
Yeah.
His whole ministry was never intended for He and He alone, as your representative and mine, to live apart from the dependence upon the revelation of the direction of His Father, to glorify His Father, or the Spirit of God. So watch out for cliches. Remember, we're believers who think, and we're thinkers who believe.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone says, God will never put you, don't watch the word never, and watch the word always.
Mm-hmm.
Usually they're never right and always wrong. Okay? So God will never allow you to go through a situation you can't handle. Yes, He will. Because He wants you to lean on Him. He wants you to cry out to Him. He wants you to ask for His help. He wants you to know what it's like when He intervenes on your behalf. And He wants to know what it's like when your burden is heavy, how He can make that yoke easy and light.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, don't get caught up in cliches.
Yeah. All right. Okay, you mentioned how we should take personal responsibility for our mistakes, but not to the point of taking shame or condemning ourselves for it. We do need to take responsibility for our actions so we don't create a cycle of repetition, like you said, on the same mistake. But is there a middle ground between being carefree and being overcritical?
Yes.
What would that be?
There's definitely a middle ground. Paul says, wish I do just keep go on sinning because of grace.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no. But does that mean he has to be legalistic? No. I keep going back to, and I've shared this with you on a personal level, I keep going back to Psalm 51. I really believe it should be a part of a person's spiritual diet, monthly, bi-monthly, whatever. We have the Eucharist that reminds us to remember the blood of Christ, and also calls us to examine ourselves. I think the middle ground is to examine ourselves, to confess our sin, to know what it means to have conviction of sin, frequent enough that we're not legalistic, and often enough that keeps us from being lackadaisical. This is something far more absent in the church than it needs to be, and I'll tell you why. If you step back and look at the church in our country, we tend to swing like a pendulum. And this is what happens when you start to maximize some aspects of Scripture and minimize others. You swing too far in one direction. So you can go from legalism to, well, the seeker-friendly movement. And its intent was wonderful. Willow Creek was the spearhead of that whole thing, the relevance of the church, reaching lost people. Bill Hybels did a great job with that. But if you do that long enough and hard enough and intense enough, you'll lose confession of sin and contrition and brokenness and dying to self. You do that, then you end up with a different gospel. Mm-hmm. I think he asked forgiveness for it. And then the irony is he had a little bit of a moral failure there. Not to pick on anybody, but it's public knowledge. So if you lead in too far in one direction and don't stay biblical and biblically balanced, you're going to end up in problems. And that's a good lesson to learn.
All right. So the last question I have for you is, what do we have to look forward to for this Sunday?
Oh, okay. Well, we're going to look at Hebrews chapter 12, verse 28 and 29. It speaks of God being a consuming fire. What is that? What does that mean? What does that mean to a culture who has every idea what it means to be consumers, but may have a little fogginess in the area of what it means for God to be a consuming fire? Mm-hmm. So we'll have opportunities to be encouraged, to be built up this Sunday. We'll also have to look at this reality. Am I more a consumer only, or am I being consumed? And what does that mean? Because we want to change. We want to be transformed into the image of Christ. Mm-hmm. So this is something for us to consider. And anyway, read the context of the passage and get ready. Get ready to rumble.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, thanks, man.
Well, thank you for joining us today on CBC Rewind, and we'll see you next week for another one.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to email Gary your questions at askgary@cbchighlands.com.